How many of you have heard this meme that's out there? ISIS was started when Obama withdrew the troops from Iraq. I didn't say, did you believe it? I said, how many of you have heard it? Yeah, come on, the rest of you are lying. You've all heard it.
All my students have heard it.
All your students have heard it. Everybody's heard it, because it's like out there. Not true. I mean, you all know it. That's why you don't want to admit that you've heard it, because you know it's not true. ISIS history is not that complicated. It has a beginning. It doesn't yet have an end, unfortunately, but it has a beginning that was not in 2011 when Obama pulled out the troops. It was in 2004, in the first year of George Bush's occupation of Iraq, when the origins of ISIS, it was called something different, and there was, it's gone through a lot of changes of names and changes of identity, but the organization that became the ISIS that we know and hate today was created in 2004 as one of many militias that were fighting against the US occupation and against the US-backed Shia-dominated sectarian government in Baghdad. In many ways, that can also be traced back to the war of 1991. So the history, when we look at the history of what is US policy in the region, we can't just start with today. We can't start with Obama's State of the Union speech last night. We can't start with any of these immediacies. We can't start with Bush after 9/11. We have to go back. We have to go back very far. But at least as far as 1991, when the Cold War is collapsing, George Bush Sr. makes a judgment that here's the way to show the world that with or without our Soviet sparring partner, we are still the superpower. What way do you do that? You don't have a press conference. You go to war. And that became the basis for going to war. So what we're facing today is a set of intersecting crises, intersecting global crises. This new war is what George Bush used to call it, the global war on terror, the GWAT. Obama, on his first day in office, said, we don't want to use that term. We would like to call it something a little more benign, so we're going to call it overseas contingency operations. Quite Orwellian. But the bottom line is, this is the continuation. This is global war on terror 2.0, if you will. And it's significant because it's very different in the nature of the war. It's a war, but it's not the same kind of war. We could go into all the analysis of counterterrorism versus counterinsurgency and Petraeus versus the other guys, but it's not about that. It's really about, are there massive numbers of US troops on the ground, which means if there are, there will be massive numbers of US casualties? Or do we outsource the casualties? Doing what they used to call during Vietnam, changing the color of the corpses. So that the people who die are Iraqis and Syrians and Afghans and Palestinians, and not Americans. So that's the choice of the nature of war. That means that we rely on small numbers of troops, relatively, still 10,000 or so in Afghanistan, about 3,000 in Iraq. Officially, there's about 50 special ops forces in Syria. We don't know how many are really there. Maybe they don't wear boots, so they don't count boots on the ground. They wear sneakers because they're special operations and CIA. We have no idea how many are there. But this is a global war, which the US is the dominant military force, but the horrific role being played by all the other military actors, from the regime in Damascus to the Iranians and the Russians to the Saudis and the Qataris and the Jordanians, all of them are making everything worse. Because at the end of the day, this new kind of war is also failing. Because the lesson that they haven't learned is that you can't bomb terrorism out of existence. You can only bomb people. You can bomb people, and sometimes you might even hit a terrorist. You might kill them. But that just creates more terrorism. You can't bomb terrorism out of existence. Terrorism survives wars, as we've seen. We have been at war against terrorism since 2001. And terrorism is thriving. People are not doing so well in those wars. Not in Iraq, not in Syria, not in the surrounding countries, not in Afghanistan, not anywhere. But you can't bomb that out of existence. It was interesting in the State of the Union the other night to hear President Obama recognize the degree to which people are so frightened by the threat of terrorism. And that terrific article in the New York Times this morning that sort of deconstructed this huge gap between the chances of actually being the victim of a terrorist attack for people in this country, which is one in something like 2.9 million, versus what people think is the fear of terrorism, which is massive. It's a huge divergence from reality. But then the article went on to say, but of course, the government can't challenge that. Well, that's our job as a movement. It's not our only job, but it's a big chunk of what we've got to do. We've got to educate people about what it means to say, yeah, could there ever be a terrorist attack? Yeah, there could be. There was one in North Carolina. No, I'm not getting to San Bernardino yet. There have been other terrorist attacks in this country, carried out by people who live and were raised and born in this country, carried out by white people, so they don't call it terrorism. And there's also terrorism like what happened in San Bernardino. So yeah, you can't stop every act of terror, particularly if people are prepared to die for it. You can make it a lot less likely. You can't necessarily stop every bit of it. But you can stop carrying out the actions that create terrorism. You all remember, looking around the room, most of you, not luckily, you guys are doing good at bringing in some younger people. Not everybody will remember, but some of you, most of you, still a lot of work to do. Most of you will remember right after 9/11, anybody who said the words root causes was immediately branded a supporter of terrorism. That was unacceptable, because if you were trying to understand it, it must mean you support it. Instead of recognizing if you're serious about stopping it, making sure it never happens again, you damn well better understand it, because otherwise you're going to fail. Well, they didn't, and they did. They didn't understand it, and they failed. They went to war and thought that was going to work, and it doesn't work. The new escalations that are now underway between the new fights that are going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which have far more to do with traditional regional concerns about military control, oil control, money control, who's the dominant hegemon in the region? Is it going to be the Saudis or is it going to be the Iranians? That has been going on for some years. It's escalating right now, and that makes everything else more dangerous. The air wars that are going on, the US air war, the Russian air war, they are devastating people. They are devastating cities. None of it is making anybody better. None of it is helping. It's all making it worse. Now, the reality of terrorism as we're seeing it playing out in the Middle East now, and the rationale for the so-called global war on terror, right now is grounded very much in the war in Syria, which is not a civil war anymore. There was a civil war aspect to it, and that aspect remains. But this is now at least 8 separate wars that are global and regional as well as national. But they're all being fought to the last Syrian. So when Saudi Arabia goes to war against Iran in Syria, it's not Saudis and Iranians who are dying, it's Syrians. That's taking place across the region, concentrated in Syria. And the consequences of that are horrific, and you know some of them. The millions of people that have been forced to flee their homes, 4 million that have been forced to flee their country, the numbers of people that are being held under siege by all the various forces, have besieged people, holding people who are now starving to death. I mean, luckily yesterday the UN got some food into 3 different towns. That's not enough. There's got to be an end to that war. And that means an end to that set of wars, because as I said, this is not just one war. That's why it's all so complicated to even imagine what the diplomacy might look like. The fact that there is diplomacy on the table, this is great, this is important, this is potentially worth something. But we cannot be anywhere close to complacent. One, that this whole process based on the Vienna talks is going to go forward. 2, that it's going to work. 3, that it will be maintained. We can't assume any of that. But we have to be looking not at how do we combine our military with other aspects of US power. We hear something from President Obama which is really important and right when he says there is no military solution. The problem is he acts as if there was, because every action that he does is a military action. And then he adds the part that isn't true. He says, well, the military part isn't enough. We also need diplomacy, we need negotiations, we need humanitarian assistance, we need this, we need that. The problem with that analysis is that it ignores the fact that it's not just about the military side isn't enough. The military side makes those other things, diplomacy, negotiations, humanitarian assistance, impossible. Imagine you're living in a Sunni community in Iraq, and you've started looking at ISIS a little differently because they at least claim that they're defending your rights against this incredibly brutal sectarian government that the UN put in, the US put in power and keeps in power and arms and backs in Baghdad, right? So you're starting to look at ISIS as maybe being on your side. You don't like what they stand for, you don't like their extremism, but they're Sunnis that are defending Sunni rights. That's one of the reasons that ISIS has become so powerful, is that they don't fight alone. But so what happens? The US goes and they bomb a Sunni-based ISIS camp. And say they got it right. They almost never do. But imagine, let's give them credit for something they've never done. They manage a bombing that only gets ISIS militants. There's no civilian casualties. It's very narrow. They get the people they're going to. And what happens back here? Yay, we got the bad guys. And what do they see? What do people in the city see? Yeah, there's the Americans again, going to war for the Shia and the Kurds against the Sunnis. We better stick with ISIS. So it perpetuates exactly what the US recognizes they need to do, which is to win people away from supporting ISIS. By going in militarily, it's creating an even greater problem. So that's the kind of failure we're looking at. Now, I don't have time. A lot of you are very familiar with some of the other failures, the more dramatic failures of these efforts to supposedly, we're going to create and train a group of Syrian fighters who are going to be loyal to democracy and loyal to us all at the same time, and they're not going to fight against the regime. They're only going to fight against ISIS. Oh yeah, how'd that work for you? $500 million, and look what they got. They got nothing. They got bupkis. So there's a lot of reasons that I'm not going to go into now because we don't have time about the reasons for this war. A lot of them haven't changed since George Bush went to war. George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. Issues around oil, around power, around the expansion of US military power. We go to war because the US government tells us the choice is either war or nothing. It's what Bush said the day after 9/11. It was 9/12, the day the world changed, when Bush said, we either go to war or we let them get away with this. It was a lie then, it's a lie now. So when we look at sort of the origins of ISIS, again, there's a long history here, but the US occupation, the US invasion of Iraq, the US imprisonment of thousands of Iraqis, the torture of Iraqis, Guantanamo, all of the prisons where torture was going on a regular basis, that's what gave rise to ISIS. That's what we have to look at when we say, why are they fighting like this? That's the origins of it. That's the origins of it. It's not all that complicated. The military escalations that are underway now threaten the potential that we saw with the diplomacy that led to the Iran deal, that set the stage for the possibility, not the inevitability by any means, but the possibility of a new diplomacy-based rather than war-based policy in the region for a while. All of the new escalations, the US escalation, the Russian escalation, all these escalations are making that much more dangerous, putting it at much greater risk.